The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
No mai hoki mai ki a the fold, e mihi nei ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guests today are Irene Gardiner, President of SPADA, and Gavin Ellis from Koitsu, the Centre for Informed Futures at the University of Auckland. These two, I don't think had met each other before this podcast. They were very aware of one another. But the reason I got them both on the podcast at the same time is that they represent two people who I would argue are pretty close to the most qualified to speak to the challenges facing news in Gavin's case and screen production in Irene's. And that's not because necessarily they are closest to the sort of industrial grindstone, but because of their specific perches, they have a sort of a pan-industrial view of their sectors. And the reason that that's striking is that they both come to the same conclusion in terms of what the best way of solving for the challenges that are in front of the screen production sector. You know, there's both TVNZ and Warner Brothers Discovery have basically knocked out almost all of their local commissioning from now on, meaning they'll be almost entirely reliant on New Zealand On Air or Te Mangai Paho. And news, you know, as we've seen with the cuts at TVNZ and the complete end of News Hub. So these are very challenged sectors that have, up until this point, largely been, you know, trying to figure out how to sort of solve for their problems on their own. What I wanted to do here was take the fact that, you know, Gavin authored this huge research report that was very well researched, very well canvassed. In terms of the total scope of the New Zealand news media industry, and has come up with the idea of a levy. SPADA called for one, I think it was 6 months ago. We have a new broadcasting minister. We have a coalition that has been hostile to the digital news bargaining bill that's currently before Select Committee. So you basically have a problem that's desperately in need of a quick patch solution. The idea that I've got them to sort of argue here is that what we might be best to do is actually combine the sort of cultural argument and the journalistic argument into one levy, split it into sort of logical income streams, but package it up into one piece of legislation, and in so doing, you stop what have been kind of parallel processes that have the same kind of ultimate underlying cause, which is the sort of flow of advertising from, you know, legacy platforms to digital ones, and I think they both make that argument very well. I have tried to test it along the way, put some of the kind of core counter arguments to them, including reading quotes from the Taxpayers Union and so on. You can be the judge of how well how robust you think the arguments are, but the drums do seem to be beating louder for a levy. You know, basically a relatively small, probably single-digit percentage of levied on the turnover, not the profits of some of the giant technology companies that operate here, the likes of Google, Meta, Netflix, and so on, and kind of ring-fencing that to solve for these sort of known issues around news and screen production in Aotearoa. It really isn't complicated, and we don't get into all of the complexities here, but the current situation doesn't feel sustainable. It also feels like, as Gavin says, like it could be an extinction event, i.e. you have to make some calls here, otherwise there just won't be much left at the end of it. So, it's an attempt to really get into the sort of nitty-gritty of one potential solve for the kind of twin crises impacting journalism and screen production, and that's the function of today's episode, with Irene Gardiner, President of SPADA, and Gavin Ellis from Koitsu on the fold. Tēnā korua, welcome to the fold. So I wondered if you could just start by explaining in turn, who you are and what your background is in terms of this discussion. Gavin, do you want to start?
Yep, sure. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm an honorary research fellow at Koitsu, the Centre for Informed Futures at Auckland University. My background, of course, is in journalism for longer than most people have been alive, but latterly as a newspaper editor, and then after that, poacher turned gamekeeper when I taught things like propaganda at Auckland University.
Fantastic, thank you. And you, Irene?
Kia ora, Duncan. I'm here wearing my SPADA president hat, the Screen Producers Guild. I'm a long-time television producer, and I have also worked as a journalist, so I am interested in the journalism side and how they intersect, but I'm not here to talk about that. That's Gavin's role. I'll do the screen side of things today.
And I wondered if you could both in turn, again, give a sense of how these respective industries, the news media and the screen production sector, are travelling at the moment. I mean, most people listening to this podcast will have a view on it, but your perspectives have been kind of closer than most in recent months. Gavin?
Well, I see the news industry as facing an existential crisis. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but I have predicted that within the term of this government, we will see, unless something changes, some disastrous consequences of market failure and social changes that have fundamentally affected the way journalism is done.
And we'll sort of drill into that in a moment. Obviously, we've had some pretty big examples of it already in the past couple of months. Irene, screen production hasn't had quite the same kind of big news moments as the collapse of Newshub, but does have a similar kind of vibe emanating from it.
Absolutely, yeah. Local production is definitely in crisis. Between 3 and TVNZ, which have historically been our biggest commissioners, we've calculated that it's about $50 million is going to come out of our industry, which is massive for a small industry like New Zealand. That's going to have a serious economic impact, but also a serious cultural impact. It is a crisis time, but there are some things that would certainly help us, which we can talk about. But yeah, some things certainly need to be done, and as Gavin said, there's an urgency.
The reason that I brought you both together here to have these a conversation which is basically to blend what have been parallel conversations that are aware of one another but haven't really been put together, and I think that's largely because the news media up until now has been working through predicated on the idea that the digital news bargaining bill is its best hope, whereas with SPADA and a lot of the screen industry has been calling for a levy. The big difference, and this is something that you've largely driven, I think, Gavin, is that this research report you've authored for Koitu has called for a levy and has suggested it as being a better solution than the bill currently before Select Committee. I wondered, Gavin, if you could sort of start by explaining the research process that you went through for that report.
Yeah. We were concerned when we saw the policy platforms for each of the political parties before the last election. There was no coherent attempt to put forward policy that would do anything to really protect the news industry or indeed the screen production industry. So we called a working group together at Koitu that brought together most of the major players, not just traditional media, Spin-Off was there, and we talked about what are the problems and what are your priorities. Now, from that, I then went on to do a series of individual interviews with people to tease out not just the problems but possible solutions. And it became abundantly clear to me during that process, and also after what I saw happening in Australia and in Canada, that trying to bargain with these platforms was a hiding to nothing, that they'd pulled out of almost identical arrangements to what's proposed here in Australia and had pulled the plug on news in Canada to prevent bargaining happening at all. So it seemed obvious to me that the bargaining bill was going to go nowhere. Even if it was passed, it would not achieve the right result. A levy, however, and SPADA has been talking about a levy, Better Public Media have been talking about a levy from different sources, but generally speaking, taking that approach. In other words, taking the bargaining out of the equation and imposing a solution. Seemed to me that was the only answer.
Irene, I wondered if you could explain why SPADA, because there's a number of different ways that you can approach this. Australia's looking at quotas. There's all kinds of different ways of achieving this kind of end. Why did SPADA settle on a levy?
We actually never 100% said, a levy is the only way to go. But we thought it was perhaps the most straightforward way to go. And so we talked about a levy, a percentage of New Zealand revenue for the big international streamers operating here. Yes, different territories have done different approaches internationally. Some have done a levy, some have done a quota, some have done a mixture of the two. A quota is quite tricky in New Zealand because of the GATT agreement, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. And so a levy just seemed potentially the most straightforward way to do it, where, you've basically got entities that have had a pretty good run here. They've been able to come in, establish a market. They don't pay tax. They use our broadband infrastructure. They harvest our data. They hurt the local industry. And, this is happening globally. And so we were basically just doing what everybody was doing internationally. We were trying to say, look, something needs to happen. This is going to really hurt us. You're going to lose local production. This is, something needs to be done. It's interesting that the journalism side of it is now also starting to talk levy. It possibly we should always have been working together, but it kind of dates back to the previous government because they were going to do the digital media bill for content for the journalism side of things, and then they were looking at a public media situation, ANZPM, for the screen side of things. And so that sort of set the two things on a different path, when in fact they possibly should always have been on the same path. And I can see a sort of a move now with the different people that we interact with at SPADA, Gavin's group and Better Public Media, different guilds, et cetera, et cetera. I can sort of see now that perhaps the model where we join it together and it just becomes a neutral levy on your New Zealand revenue, and it takes in both the streamers who hurt local production and the Google, Facebook type people who hurt journalism. They take advertising. In our case, they take eyeballs and advertising. So it does seem quite a sensible way to do it, that you would just set an amount, get it in, and then we just have to work out how best to administer it, whether it's through the existing funding agencies or whether we set up a special body or whatever. Because, the point that Gavin's been making, you've basically got two industries that are in peril. And you can kind of go, okay, well, things change and who cares and da-da-da. But, journalism and local production are not just any old business. They are a country's voice and sovereignty. So, yeah.
So I do want to get into some of the counter-arguments. I've got some quotes from the Taxpayers Union who, have laid out a particular position that, look, it's not an indefensible perspective. It might not be one I share, but I think it's important to engage with the counter-arguments to this. But before we get there, in fact, we should probably have done this at the start, but I wondered if you could, you kind of touched on it there, Irene, for the screen production sector, but there is could you sort of explain why, Gavin, from News's perspective, that you think that it is such a problem that there has been this, the collapse of News Hub, for example, and these further sort of existential threats as you describe them, what we lose when we start to lose big chunks of our news infrastructure?
Well, first of all, you lose the ability to hold power to account, hold truth to power. There is no other institution than journalism that is capable of doing that on the scale and with the critical mass that journalism does. Sure, you'll have individuals podcasting or blogging saying the government's got this wrong, or, whatever. That has no critical mass. The totality of journalism and the plurality of journalism, across a whole range of organisations is what gives it its strength. Now, I don't know of any other organisation or any other institution, rather, that's capable of doing that, hence the title of the paper. If not journalists, then who? And I'm damned if I know who, apart from journalists. And the role that they play is democratically important, socially important. Journalism has a critical role in social cohesion, in us creating and nurturing common views, consensus, collective opinion, and dialogue, and even argument, healthy. And we also have a cultural role to play as well, and that's in parallel with what the creative industries are doing. In a way, we're also part of that voice. We give voice to the creative industries before they get to screen, for example.
Can I ask you, because I've been speaking to some politicians and people around politics about this lately, and one of the things that they say when the argument that you make, it's eloquent, it's reasonably well understood, and certainly people within journalism buy it. The counter argument that does get made is that trust in journalism is plummeting, and that some of the practice of journalism, whether it's the kind of inflation around the way issues are framed, the hierarchy of stories, the sometimes blurring of lines between opinion and reporting, and the sort of selectivity around which facts are emphasised and which stories or sort of beats are kind of downplayed. Do you have sympathy for that idea that were there to be a levy, that there needs to be some sort of restatement or course correction of the approach to journalism, or do you think that that's something that the market figures out, if it is able to stabilise?
I sympathise with it. I've said that as part of the process of change, journalism itself has to change. It is too driven by real-time analytics, which tell them who's looking at what, perhaps. It's far from precise, and it certainly does not look for journalistic values, democratic values. It's basically a commercial instrument. Now, there was a time when journalism was governed strictly by journalistic values. The hell with the advertiser. You know, I can recall taking calls as editor of the Herald when somebody will say, I'm an advertiser, you know, and my response to that is, yes, and? You know, now I'm not sure that when you're driven by analytics, that's the process that happens. I think we need a reset of our journalism and a return to solid journalistic values and a sense of why this is important. Not who's going to look at it, but why is this important? And I think that's the question that our journalists need to ask more and more. I think they also need to, as an absolute must, separate out news and opinion. Too often, their opinions are conflated into a news story, and then they wonder why they are accused of being left-wing or right-wing or whatever. The reason is that their opinion is becoming mixed up in the story, and if they separated it out, that would help, I think, to overcome part of that trust problem.
So some of the issues or what makes this hard for screen production they're quite different, but they're also, I guess, ideas or conceptions that have to be overcome in order to get this levy into play. One of those is that screen production is very well supported from some perspectives. If you look at the screen production rebate, the spur, if you look at New Zealand On Air, Te Mangai Paho, the Film Commission, it's by some angles one of the most well-funded sort of industries, I suppose you'd say, out there. And here it is asking for more, essentially. What is your response to that?
I mean, that's an absolutely fair question. We're very lucky that successive governments have supported our industry through the 3 screen funding agencies and through the screen production rebate. But we are also part of a $3 billion industry that helps the New Zealand economy. I mean, that's significant. Now, to be fair, quite a lot of that is internationals working here. Some of it is local. But you don't get that big international bit that makes money for New Zealand without a healthy local sector to help feed it. And also in recent times, because we've had enough years of the screen production rebate now, we're starting to make a lot of international shows, a lot of co-productions, a lot of shows that are selling internationally. So we're actually starting to get good export dollar back into New Zealand. So we actually do kind of pay for ourselves. It's kind of always difficult because there's 2 arguments, because there's a cultural argument and there's an economic argument. If you're arguing the cultural argument, you know, the money coming from the funding agencies, that is a public media spend, you know, for a certain type of content. And our public media spend is actually small by international standards because, of course, we don't have a public media TV channel. So our spend is small. But that's, you know, so that's one part of the argument. But then the other part of the argument is we're actually worth investing in because the money that goes in does come back. And because we're losing $50 million in ad revenue, because ad revenue was always what just comfortably paid for our more commercial shows, and funding agency money paid for our less commercial, more public media shows. So because we're losing that $50 million, that's what's causing the, how do we keep, like, even if we're going to get this levy and we're going to get some money out of it, that's presumably a year or so away. And so we've got a short-term problem that, you know, I'm hoping can be addressed with a couple of things. One, at the very least, not taking the 7.5% across-the-board government cuts out of our funding agencies' contestable funding money. And I know this is a big ask in the current climate, but it would be great if we could have, you know, 20 million put into our funding agencies' coffers just to keep us going till we get to the levy, or potentially TVNZ and 3 as online entities start to make a bit more ad rev again. But yeah, it's hard, and it is a tricky one for the screen industry because we have both a cultural argument and an economic argument, and they're both important arguments because the New Zealand voice is important. That's a part of what Gavin has been talking about how essential journalism is to democracy and national identity and all of those things. And we hook into that as well because it's watching TV together, it's social cohesion. And of course, television is everything. It's documentary as well as, the lighter side of things. So yeah, it's an argument that we're already quite well supported, and for me to then say, well, actually, we need a little bit more support. But to be fair, we're just asking for a level playing field because what has hurt us, we would be okay. We would be okay with what we've always had if the streamers had not been able to come in here all of those years ago and just do whatever they liked, no tax, use the broadband, harvest the data, take the audience, and no one did anything. It wasn't a level playing field. It broke the model. And it broke the model of an industry that has significance beyond economic. And it's done it for screen production and it's done it for journalism.
Gavin, do you want to talk about this? Because part of the issue with a levy is going to be how it's administered. And within screen production, it's on some level simpler. Like we've got an existing system, and whether you pick one drama or another comedy, it's not that big of a deal. But we've just seen through the Public Interest Journalism Fund how fraught it is when the government starts to pick projects in the journalistic space.
Yeah. Let me deal first, though, with the question you put to Irene, because there is a real danger in substituting an existing sum of money, and a rebate is a sum of money, with the levy. The levy must not be a substitute for existing funding. End of story. It must not.
Why?
It is new money. It is new money. Because if you simply substitute, you cure nothing.
But I guess that depends on the quantum, right?
No,
if you take a $20 million sum and replace it with a $60 million sum, it's a substitute of a pipe.
You're not. You're replacing it with $40 million because you're taking $20 million away. But look, if we set this levy at the average of where it is internationally, it will not generate hundreds of millions of dollars. Let's be real about it. We'll be talking probably no more than $50 million, $60 million in total. So it's important that this is seen for what it is. Now, I have characterised the journalistic side of it as compensation. Compensation for goods and services that have been taken in the past, are being taken now, and will be taken in the future. So now, you can characterise it also as a substitution for unpaid tax. Characterise it how you like. But if we start to look at using it, to use your phrase, to clean up a system, then we're going to actually end up with very little extra money at all. Now, the point is that both journalism and screen production need more money than they currently have. Otherwise, they will lose that critical mass and they will die. The craftspeople within the screen production industry will go elsewhere. Journalists will go elsewhere, and we won't train anymore. So it's as simple as that. As far as the distribution of it goes, I think that's really up to the players. And one of the players is not the government. It is not for the government to decide how this money is dispersed. It is for those. It is compensating. And for that reason, in the paper, I didn't specify a system for doing that, but simply point out that the system must be devised by those who are going to be the beneficiaries and the public.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Let's talk a bit more about the sort of how of it. Can you are there we're sort of well aware of the Australian and Canadian examples within news where they passed this law. Meta has behaved incredibly aggressively, and that's why you've rightly, I think, sort of shied away from that in terms of your proposal. But the levy side, isn't nearly so. It's not so. It doesn't seem so combustible. Can you, describe whether it's happening in a news context elsewhere in the world, where it's happening, what kinds of funds it's generating? Just give us a picture of what that other channel looks like.
It's a varied mix. There are about 14 countries that currently have a digital services tax. Now, it's used for different purposes in different countries. Some, it is simply a tax gathering alternative, given the extraordinarily adept tax avoidance that these people manage. In others, it's a cultural levy. Now, I think that we may be the first country, particularly if we have a combined levy that covers screen production and journalism. I think we would be the world beater on that, that specifically dedicating it to two public goods, interrelated public goods, I have to say, would perhaps be a first. But in terms of the imposition of the levy, no, it's not novel. And it's not something that's going to send GAT into a tailspin. They might like to go into a tailspin, they generally do, but these levies are a reality elsewhere. There's no reason why they can't be a reality here.
So, Irene, in terms of the quantum of funding that it might raise, or, can we talk a bit about the scope of this? Because one of the arguments, a writer who I really love in this area and I think makes very sort of logically laid out arguments, is Benedict Evans, who former venture capitalist who now sort of analyses technology and media. He's been a scathing critic of the Australian approach and has long said, if you want to fund media or culture, then don't be a coward about it. So call it what it is, and put a levy in place. And so on that level, I'm sure he'd be agreeing. But one thing that he consistently states is that defining the borders of these things is really difficult. Advertising, if you include retail media, is it search? Is it social? Is it paying to kind of put your link to a particular product higher within Amazon or within Uber? And for you, in terms of streamers, it's clearly Netflix. It's clearly aspects of Amazon's income, but not all of it. And then they don't necessarily break that out. Is it YouTube? Can you talk a bit about how you define scope definition for these enormous corporations, which actually typically don't file highly detailed local accounts?
No, they don't. And, we've always thought of it as Netflix, Amazon, Disney, Apple, because they're, the ones operating here. Netflix obviously is the biggest. But
YouTube is a bigger channel.
Yes. And, we saw YouTube being on the journalism side of it with Facebook and Google. So if we were to combine, then I think you'd be looking at those, big multi-techers.
So the big paid streamers, essentially.
Yeah, those big multi-tech media entities. And to me, a levy is more palatable because it's a small percentage.
Do you have an idea of how small?
Not really, and I'd prefer the ministry, government to do that work and work out what would work best for New Zealand. Internationally, it is tending to be around 5%, but, we'll see. It won't, when we were looking at it just purely as the streamers, it was not going to be an enormous amount of money. It was, it was probably going to be like maybe 20 million, which, if we're losing 50 million in advertising revenue is, we're still down a bit there. But yeah, we know that already the internationals are pushing back on this. And, they've pushed back all around the world, so there's no reason they won't push back on New Zealand. And it might be harder for us because we're a small territory and we have less might. But then again, I do wonder if we do take that approach where we join journalism and local production together, we just go for a simple percentage levy, then it comes back either through the existing funding agencies or through something new. Probably makes sense to do it through the existing ones. Is that sort of more palatable? And could we actually end up being, the small country at the bottom of the world who actually did quite an innovative thing that becomes a bit of a model? Because they're always going to push back because that's what big corporations do. But this is not an unfair ask. I mean, they've had a very, very good ride. And whether you describe it as a cultural levy or a you've done some societal harm levy, or whether you just call it a working in New Zealand, being in our territory levy. It just seems time. I mean, they can't just. I mean, this is a global issue. We are going to lose local journalism and local storytelling around the world. That is not even in the streamers' interest. They need content, so it's not in their interest to hurt local content internationally.
So I wondered if, in terms of that sort of the argument around it being, these being on some level essential services that were previously funded by advertising, that advertising it's not vanished from the market, it's just gone into other places. And when it moved into other places, it's gone from being quite taxation heavy, both in terms of PAYE, GST, and company tax, because these were, it was formerly largely located in very profitable local media entities. It's gone into these entities which have a very small local footprint in terms of employment and through transfer pricing tend to move a lot of their income off stream. Based on your own conversations with, we have a new minister now, we've got a very new government, some of which can feel quite friendly towards us, at other times hostile. Do you have a sense of how a levy would land with particular, with this government more broadly? Like, do you think this thing has a shot, essentially?
Absolutely. I think it's very likely that they will give it a really good try. They may not succeed through no fault of their own because of the pushback from the internationals, but I think they're going to give it a go. I feel really confident that this government will try it. Because how can they not? I mean, we can't, it's a broken model, and you can go, okay, well, other industries die, move, change, whatever. And you'll notice I'm not saying we're losing 50 million, give us 50 million. I'm accepting that we're going to contract a bit, but we can't contract to the point where we barely exist, because we're not just any old industry, and journalism is certainly not just any old industry. I mean, that argument, it just goes almost without saying. So, yeah.
Well, what about you, Gavin? Do you have a sense that there's potentially a more sympathetic air now that we have a new minister?
Well, I think that they'll be sympathetic to a proposition that doesn't require them to spend any of their existing money. What we're talking about here is basically an existing piece of legislation. We already have the Digital Services Tax Bill, which is sitting in limbo in Parliament at the moment. What we're saying is simply add to that. Add a few clauses to that and use the money in a ring-fenced way for these purposes. Now, I think that it must be attractive to this government that it's not asking for a handout. In both screen production and journalism, we are talking about compensation. And we're talking about compensation from, if you just take the platforms that plunder journalism, let me give you a couple of figures. We've had, in the last decade, a 56% increase in advertising spend in New Zealand. It's now up at over 2 billion. In the same period, traditional media revenue has dropped by a quarter. Now, all of that increase, more than all of that increase, is going to platforms that, over that decade, have paid a laughable amount of tax to this country. Laughable. Now, I think that any government who sees the sort of walk away that they're taking has got to be sympathetic to ways to get some of it back and use it to good purpose.
It's that second part, though, that I wonder about, that what's to stop the government saying, yes, you're right, we are losing revenue here, but the digital giants, some of will argue that what they're doing is not actually at the expense of news. What they've done is create a whole suite of more specialised products that take things that were previously, direct mail or classified advertising, or we used news as a byproduct and have routed around them, and so I guess what I wonder is, what if the government were to sort of look at that and say, yes, we have a revenue problem here, but the revenue isn't as causally related to, the sort of cultural and journalistic goods that you represent? Do you think there's a danger of that kind of scenario playing out?
Let me take you back a bit. Some years ago, there was a suggestion that the government was going to reintroduce criminal libel in this country. Now, I called together all of the mainstream media and we told the government of the day, if you introduce this and pass it into law, we will not cover the next election campaign because it will be too dangerous to do so. Dropped like a stone. If this government or the next government introduces a levy and takes all of the money, puts it in the consolidated fund and uses it to build roads to nowhere, then it will bear the consequences of not having anybody to cover the next election because they won't be there.
Well, that's one of the ironies. I've mentioned this before, I think, on this podcast, that the gallery is the one place that hasn't really shrunk, proportionate to the rest of news, in large part because politics news is still so vital or popular in an online context, and therefore politicians don't, even if you've been there 20 years, you might not see your local, as in gallery journalists having changed, whereas, if you worked at Auckland Council, for example, you've got a very different view into it.
But the gallery wouldn't be there if it didn't have outlets for its journalists. So lose the outlet, you lose the gallery.
Precisely. So let's now just talk. There are a number of critics of this kind of approach. In a local context, one of the loudest is the Taxpayers Union, which, and I'm just going to read you a quote from their recent press release. It had a very sort of a classic Taxpayers Union headline that was basically ivory tower academics suggest taxing Netflix to subsidise Video Easy and Blockbuster. And this is the quote: "If producers of better and cheaper goods and services were forced to stump up cash every time they threatened an incumbent, we would still be using horse and cart to get around. The reality is that consumer preferences are changing, so media must change with it. Some companies are already doing this successfully, and we should not artificially prop up those who are unable to compete and crowd potentially better content out from the market." Either of you, what's your response to that rhetorical position?
If I manufactured an ice cream and you took my ice cream and didn't pay me for it, the Taxpayers Union would be up in arms because that's theft. It's theft of goods. And what we've seen and what we're still seeing is the appropriation of content or the use of material, not necessarily first-hand, second-hand, even third-hand, but derivative use of material that if it wasn't there, they wouldn't have the revenue from it. Now, I regard what we're talking about as compensation. Compensation for goods and services, no more, no less. Now, I'm sure the Taxpayers Union is well aware of where goods and services lead to the payment of more tax or less tax. Goods and services are part of the market that they support. So I don't buy that criticism at all. I think that what we're talking about is fair dealing.
What about you, Irene? The sort of equivalent argument would be that it's consumer preference, that they're choosing to watch Netflix or actually more likely YouTube over local productions, which are available on the likes of 3Now and TVNZ Plus.
I'd make two arguments to that. One is, and I would have thought this would be perhaps the more resonant one with the Taxpayers Union. I would remind again that we are a $3 billion industry and that the money invested into that via the rebate and via our funding agencies comes back in spades. So we're a good investment. We have a good return on investment in the screen sector. But the more cultural argument, yes, you can say it doesn't matter. People are watching what they want to watch. Who cares whether it's New Zealand or not? But actually, if you take that to its absolutely nth conclusion, and no one is watching any New Zealand content anymore, and we've lost the New Zealand voice and our humour and our culture and our identity, I think that would be pretty sad.
Agree. So let's try and end up on something a bit more optimistic, because on some level, what you're both describing is something which feels like a durable solution. The issue that we've had with even with the digital news bargaining bill, with the PIJF, with Te Puna Kairangi, these are all sort of patches, and all they did was kick the can down a road a bit. Talk about the levy in terms of because what it would be so fantastic for both journalism and for screen production would be to stop sort of examining themselves endlessly and start to just get to their core business, because far too much of the bandwidth seems to be in that place at the moment. Can you sort of basically, in turn, maybe you start, Irene, just describing what a sort of a sustainable industry that's not perpetually arguing for an expansion of its
existence.
Would look like.
Yeah, it was interesting what Gavin was saying about trust in media and improving journalism. You're not going to do any of those things if there's less funding in the industry, So, yeah, the idea of some new money that, the government doesn't have to stump up for is a wonderful thing. And this seems the fairest place to go looking for it, because this is what's taken the money out. Whether you argue that directly or indirectly. It seems like a straightforward, nothing is completely straightforward, but, a couple of things have tripped themselves up because they were too complicated, and ANZ PM is a good example of that. And, I think the digital media, I can never remember what it's called, is potentially the same. So, yeah, let's do something pragmatic and straightforward, see if we can get some new money into the industry. Don't take the old money out unless these people are making a lot more money than we think they are, and it is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars coming in, then we could probably give up some of our government money, but I suspect it's not.
What about you, Gavin? You talked about this possibility of a kind of a refocusing on some core principles of journalism that might come out of it. Describe what an end point to this process might be.
I think it's important that our news media re-examine what they do. You can't have continuing declines in trust and continuing increases in news avoidance without it coming back to what is being done by journalists and by the organisations that employ them. They have got to re-examine how they do what they do. That's one leg of the issue. The levy is only one part of the solution. The problem is much, much broader than that, Duncan. As you know as well as I do, we have anachronistic laws and structures that need to be changed as well. So you've got the three legs. Journalists, fix your own problems. Government, fix the funding and market issues. And thirdly, fix the legislative base on which it's all driven.
Sounds very simple. Hey, thank you both so much for coming on the fold today, and really think you both done fantastic work in terms of bringing this, the complexities, but also the opportunities of this challenge to light.
Thank you.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spinoff. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spinoff member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spinoff Podcast Network.